So for the sake of recording, we're fixing this button program. It's giving us a syntax error, unexpected token. You want to give me the first thing I need to do? So what's this saying? So
Change the bracket to a squiggly. The last bracket.
Yep, so that's a bracket like that, and now we're gonna change it to a squiggly, or sometimes I like to call them squiggly brackets. Okay, so what do we got here? So I fixed that, saved it, reran it. Looks like we still have a syntax error with a.
There's location error in assumption.
Okay. So what do I need to do?
Either make them both double or both single.
I think it's gonna change it to single.
Change the and to a $sign.
Okay, so change this. Okay, cool. So now it looks like it's actually doing what we call interpolation. That's what that's called. So this just is, it's interpreting it as a literal string with ampersands or the brackets. Now, okay, cool. So let's see. Okay, so now we have a reference error, okay? And one thing I do want to point out, because it's something that we need to kind of go over a little bit, is this, whenever an error is thrown in JavaScript, what it ends up printing out for you is what's called a stack trace, okay? So most languages, including JavaScript, will keep track of the breadcrumb, so to speak, of what ran what when the error occurred, okay? So you read this backwards. The most top level thing that happened here is down here, but the thing that's most relevant is what's here. So what this is saying is at object.anonymous, okay? But it's pointing you to the file and the line number. So this is saying test.js, line 8, starting at column 1. Okay. So then I'm going to go here, I'm going to go line 8, say main entry point is not defined. Okay. So that's where the issue is.
So
Okay, cool. Great. What I often do, because I don't want to have to worry about spelling all the time, is I just copy and paste what it is, make sure that the function declaration is spelled right, and then just copy and paste where I want it. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, good morning, sunshine. So that I can train this. Yeah.
Dude, there's an extension for spelling that is like
So good.
so good. Yeah. It should help because like that would be underlying that misspelled word. And yeah, I love that extension. So great.
I can consider myself a pretty good speller, but whenever your mind's on the code, it's not worrying about spelling often, so. So it looks like we fixed this. Does what we said make sense now, or, okay? Yeah, so when we say node script or JavaScript script, we're talking about just the file. And when we say node, we're like making a JavaScript file and run it. So. Okay, cool. So today we want to make sure to introduce our midway challenge. Okay. So we have that pushed up to the curriculum. We have two different pieces to the midway challenge, and don't worry, we're going to introduce the concepts you need to get started. And then like, as you're learning programming, this is often the case. So if you feel this way, do not be discouraged. This is what it feels like. You're going to kind of like stumble through it, and then we're going to help you in class, and then you're going to stumble through it some more, and you're going to make slow progress that way. It's going to feel like you're just kind of like, it's going to feel messy. Okay. You are learning. And sometimes it feels like, oh, what am I doing? But you're catching so much more than you think you are often whenever you're working with this stuff. But it's kind of cool because you're going to actually build something like what you would work with, like, both on the browser and on the node side. So yeah, we are going to introduce some concepts on how to get data from the internet and work with JavaScript in what's called an asynchronous way. JavaScript is an asynchronous programming language. I'll explain what that means. And introduce some of those concepts so that you can get started on this. If you do happen to feel like you're ahead or like you're picking up on things, then by all means, feel free to jump in and try stuff. And in fact, obviously, we encourage all of you all to try the challenges. We encourage you to try and get as far as you possibly can. If you happen to finish it or you get a finished product, like great, and continue. I guess my advice there would be continue to challenge yourself, continue to see how you can change it. A lot of times when you get to the space where you feel a little bit more settled working with the code, that's where like the cool part of programming where you're like getting to be creative, like really comes into play. And make your own things, and it becomes, less about break fix or whatever, and feels more like actual like creating, like a creative process, right? So engineering is really creative if you once you really get into it. So just know that that's like where we're going, and as you learn, that's where you'll progress to. Even though it feels like like I said, you're stumbling through it now. And that's how it feels. That's just how it feels for everybody. You're not the only one who feel that way. So we have the browser challenge. The browser challenge is creating a web app that shows the weather for today. So what you can do, and this is very, very common process where you have some data source out there, and the way you access that data source is through their API, but you have to sign up for that API and get like a token, be able, or like register your sign on, whatever it is. So that's what we'll kind of go through. I'll kind of get you started on that piece. And then you'll write code that in the browser will pull that data, and then you can do whatever you want with the data. You can put it in the DOM, you can create manipulations. Whenever it's your own application, or if the API allows you to write back to their database, then you can actually change that. You can create manipulation, your user will give you data, you change the data, and then you actually change the data on the database side. In this case, this will just be kind of like a read only, like we're just reading the data from the internet. So a couple of concepts that we'll need is in the README for 4, and we'll get to that today to get you started. The other challenge is the node side. So that was the browser challenge where you can actually paint to a web application. This one will be just CLI. And this will be similar. You sign up for an API at a dummy API used for learning. And then you'll be able to pull different bits of data based on their URL, like this URL. And then you'll be able to you'll be able to pull the same data set just in different ways in order to answer questions like these ones here. And we can even create like a like a interactive program if we want, where it's like reading questions or trying to read answers and see if it's correct, that kind of stuff. There's different ways to solve this problem, but this will be really fun too. So this is going to be a really good challenge. I highly encourage everyone to take a stab at it, and yeah, I think that's all I wanted to cover on that. So again, we're going to go over today some concepts with JavaScript that you do need to learn in order to get started on this. Before we get started on that, per the poll, what concepts or what do you feel like you have questions on, or that you're not grasping, or that you feel like you're taking some time to grasp that is making you feel behind? Or like it's harder to keep up? Is it just maybe the pace, like it just takes some time? Or is there something, certain concept we can cover real quick to kind of reinforce?
For me, I think just doing anything in the terminal stresses me out.
Mhm.
I'm just not used to it.
Mhm.
So that's where I kind of struggle because I'm trying to like learn all the new stuff with that, which is not a lot of stuff, but like watching you do it, I'm like, okay.
Yeah, that might be partially, that's probably a lot of my fault because when you work with it so much, I just move fast and I don't intend to. I'm just trying to get stuff out there for us to learn. But no, I totally get that. And it's very intimidating at first, for sure.
Guess we didn't really teach them like the terminal commands. Oh yeah,
I covered them very quickly.
yeah. Maybe worth doing that again.
Yeah. Well, let's go over it real quick. What's the command for making a new directory?
I know how to change directory, that's about it.
CD? Yeah. So then I have it right there. So it's funny, I remember whenever I was first in the getting started in IT stuff, I had some responsibilities and I had to log onto the server and do a lot of this. And that was the only command I did was CD, but it got me far in what I needed to know. Yeah, so CD change directory. What do we got? What we have CD. We have make directory in KDIR. So now I have that with the curriculum. What if I wanted to just create a blank file really quickly? What would does anyone remember that command? How would I do that? There is another command. I don't want to use too much. Honestly, at this point, it's if you know CD, make dir, and touch, and ls, those are the. Because at this point, I'll just do a code open, and I can do it all kind of in VS Code and stuff like that. So, do you remember what the home character is?
Squiggle.
Yep. I always put it in the dev directory, so I'm just going to cd in the dev. That's where I was with OK coder stuff. Yeah, here's what I'll say about the terminal. I agree it's intimidating. And whenever we get into working with projects and working particularly with Git, you'll have to, it's just something you kind of have to work with very, very frequently. So again, I think I said this, but I'm going to reiterate it. I never sat and memorized the things. It was the way to think about this, and this is actually a really good piece of advice I think for code in general, is think about the thing you want to do and then look up how to do it. Right? So I know, like, for instance, if I'm in this and I want to change, I want to move around, it's like, okay, the thing, because that's what that's going to do is it's going to tell me what I need to do, which is like your most important skill in this line of work, 100%. There's no question. Your most important skill is like getting good at Googling. So the best way to think about it is, I know there's a goal, so thinking about the problem you have, but whether it's a terminal and how you want to navigate around, or whether it's in the code and thinking about what you want to build or what your end goal is for a function or whatever, you think about, this is the thing that I want to get done, and then you Google, how do I, reverse a string? Like, I want a string to be reversed. So then you look that up. How do I take the keys of an object and alphabetize them or whatever? Like, how do I make a new directory in Linux? Or like, because this is a Mac, so it's like Linux-based terminal. But how do I make a new directory on the command line in Windows? How do I create a new file with whatever? So again, though, like, feeling like you're comfortable with it is not the same thing as actually being able to do it. Like, you can do it. So I totally understand that it is intimidating, but I guess there's higher value things to spend like your attention learning than like memorizing command line commands is all I'm trying to say. Is there anything else specifically that you wanted to cover with like CLI stuff?
No, I don't think so. It's just, the hard part is like, you don't know what you don't know. So like, I like trying to Google things. I'm like, can I do that there? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Well,
just getting used to it.
and in that instance, I say just do it, just trial and error, because like probably 60% of the time I've Googled the thing that I'm Googling already before, because like I'll see the purple links, and it's like I just didn't retain it. I just copy and paste or whatever, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But you're right, like but you're honing in that skill, right? So don't expect yourself to be a perfect Googler, like off the bat. Like, you're getting used to learning how to Google. It's a skill. It truly is a skill.
On Windows, this whole command line situation is even.
We're
more
about to
challenging.
wipe this and turn it all into Linux. So
That's good.
that's what we're doing this weekend.
Yeah. Yeah, so
Very
the whole like WSL thing on Windows is like really pretty confusing. And so it's not a huge deal if you're not able to move around and get everything working in there yet. It's gonna matter once we get to React and the server stuff. Like for this module, it's still more about learning JavaScript than anything else.
Yeah. Right. You're still learning the language. We're just trying to be really practical with it, because it's easy for curriculum to be very just like in a vacuum. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to actually implement it. So.
Like for me, it might be really helpful for whenever we do this midway challenge to kind of like identify the pathway with which we're utilizing Node.
Yeah.
Like kind of connecting, because piecewise, like the JavaScript is really easy to get a handle of, just kind of work at it. But having the workflow from VS Code to working whatever directories you need to work through to actually utilize Node, like that would, that's kind of what's still abstract to me, is like, what's the workflow? Piecewise, it's pretty easy.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. I can go through making like how I would make a project. Yeah, let me do that kind of like towards the end. We'll cover our JavaScript concepts, and then I'll like go through like how I would make a new project, which I've done that with this, but I'll make it outside of the curriculum, because that might be part of the confusion too, is like that we have this repo that we've been working in to be able to push to, but I'll just make it a completely different one and show you how to do that.
I also installed a boot camp so I can make a video doing it in Windows, because it's like so different than on Mac.
That would be,
Because you have to do this, there's like this like remote extension to like VS Code be connected to, and it's like kind of a nightmare.
seriously?
Well, I mean, like once you get used to it, it's fine, but I just mean it's a nightmare for somebody new. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's a nightmare for
It's not
me,
straightforward.
but
I'm not saying.
yeah. So I can make a
I'm
video.
a good programmer. Cool. Well, let's go ahead just for the sake of time and move forward with stuff. It's good to get y'all's feedback. We'll try and reiterate some topics and kind of go over stuff. Again, another thing too is that to remember is that like a lot of stuff we return to. So like it's not like you feel like you have to completely additive everything that we're learning. It's stuff that you kind of like get exposed to and then you kind of return to it in a deeper way, then you return to it again. So even as we move forward with this kind of stuff, it'll be stuff that you've seen before, just in a new context and a little bit more advanced. So, yeah, cool. So what we're gonna do in day 4 is I want to cover a couple of things. The first thing I want to cover is conceptual. So I link this in the resources. But there's a concept in programming called like synchronous versus asynchronous. And the way to think about this is, so when programming was first kind of like happening, it was designed in a way where you had this file like this, right? And let's even like not, take a function out of it. Function kind of like takes code and like puts it where you can run it at any time. So that's even like more advanced than what I'm talking about. But like you might have just stuff that's like, do one thing, do another. And it's like, it's literally line by line by line. That is synchronous code. It's procedural, another word for it, but it's like line by line. And the program reading the file and running that code is also made in such a way where it's supposed to go line by line by line. Well, with JavaScript was made first for the browser, right? And one of the challenges with something like that is that you have a lot going on. You have the internet, like internet calls being made, right? You have like user interactions that are happening in a sequence that you cannot predict. You have to just receive them raw and then find a way to handle those. So JavaScript is intended to be asynchronous. It's the code is written and it executes in such a way that you can't guarantee that like, line 15 is going to be run, before or after line 2 or 3 or whatever. Once a program gets into like the core business logic, it's going to be out of order, or should I say, in an order that you can't necessarily predict every single time that you run it. That becomes even more exacerbated. Like that problem becomes even more difficult to like work with when you have a lot of things going on whenever you're trying to like receive inputs from a user. Let's say that you make a API call to get data, right? So we're building our weather app. We have, let's say, like a button that's like, go get me the weather for today. When that happens, I don't know how long it's going to take for that request and that data to get back to me. So JavaScript's made to handle that, but we also have to write code that also handles that well. And JavaScript has what we call APIs, the functions and methods for us to do that. But we just have to know that that's how it's working in the background. So like two ways of thinking about this. One is think about if you were on like, the Facebook or some social media web application. One of the things that's happening is like, say you have your friends list. On Twitter, you'd have like a bunch of new incoming tweets. You would have things trending. You'd have refreshes happening. You'd have potential incoming messages. You'd have people liking in real time a tweet. You'd have retweets happening in real time. On Facebook, it might be like you have friends coming on and offline. There's a lot going on. And you cannot guarantee, you can't know what's going on with all that happening at once. So the code has to be written in a way where it can handle that. You've been exposed to one of the ways JavaScript is intended to handle that. It's called eventing or like event-driven kind of way of doing it. It's kind of like this idea of like, again, I don't know what's going to happen, but when it does happen, here's the thing that I've defined will handle that, an event handler. For instance, document.getElementById, we get the idea of a button, and then we attach a function, and that function gets run. It's called an event handler. It's handling the event of the click. There's other things like network requests or you've kind of seen it. If we were to go back to the CLI, that article that I posted, the Codecademy article about reading the reading line. We use a library to make it really simple. We don't have to look at that. But if you were to look at the Node APIs for read line, it has events. It's like on, question, on exit, on whatever. That's another way of saying event handling. And another way of thinking about it is like when we initiate our CLI program that we made last time, the one like the guess the number, for instance, it's running in the background indefinitely until we do Control C. Well, Control C is an event. What it's saying is keep this alive, and then there's an event handler that says kill the process whenever we receive that event. That's another way of thinking about it. So events are everywhere. Our way of working with asynchronous JavaScript is everywhere. That is all for stuff. Events are really, really useful for times when we don't know when that's going to happen and it's outside of our control. Like that whatever the thing is that we're expecting, we know it's going to happen, but it's outside of our control. We're not initiating it, in other words. And we just have to have something there that will handle that situation. However, there are also situations where we need to be asynchronous, but it is something that we initiate, okay? So one way that JavaScript lets us do that is a concept called a promise. We need to know about promises, so I'll tell you where we're going with this. So in order to make an API call, I want to be able to give you at least just the raw tools to try your first API, okay? And I'm introducing these concepts so that we can know how to work with it when it's coming back. We need a couple of main concepts. We need to know promises, and I'll explain why. In order to use what's called the fetch API. Fetch is the function that's available in JavaScript that will allow us to be able to make an API call like this. And a promise is where you see this .then. Okay. So essentially what that's saying is go fetch this. I don't know when that's going to return. I have no idea what's going to happen. I don't know when it's going to happen at all. But what I can do is I can use the promise object to say .then after you've returned, after you've successfully resolved, then do this function. And then you can even chain them together. Like in this case, what's happening here is I can explain what's going on here once we get to it, but this is returning another promise. So you can chain and have kind of a chain of handlers for being able to handle this particular promise. So I have to introduce promise or asynchronous JavaScript. That's why we work with JavaScript the way we do, and why we need something like a promise. We need the promise object to be able to understand how the fetch API works. And then we need the actual fetch API. Okay. So we are going to write our promises with the fetch API using .then because that's how a lot of the fetch API documentation is written. But I did also want to expose you to one other concept, which is JavaScript is naturally asynchronous. And so they have this idea, this concept of async await. Okay. So what's happening here, and I can send this over just if you want to take a look at it, but this is just informational. So But what I'm going to explain is this is using a promise, but it's going to handle a promise not in the .then syntax, which is like wrapping the functions and saying, run this whenever this happens. But instead in a more, it's a way to try and write it in a slightly more like line by line looking fashion. So instead of this being, this function here being fired anytime whenever it does return, async await would allow us to call it slightly differently. So this is maybe not a good example. Let's do. Okay, yeah, so this is I'll go ahead and post this one too. So when a promise, like a promise is being returned, it's naturally asynchronous. And one of the ways we can handle it is to use the await operator. So instead of doing like make this call then we can await that call. I can show you what this looks like, but I guess I want to expose you to this concept knowing that we'll return to it later, because we're not going to write it this way. We're going to do it then. And it's important that you know kind of both, again, because when you are, Googling stuff and you come across documentation, you're going to see both. And so we want you to have the ability to kind of like decipher what's going on and then be able to read the documentation. It's very, very important. So again, there's two different ways to write promises. There's the await syntax, async and await. I'll show you what that looks like. And then there's the then. We'll get used to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the I think that this is actually JavaScript. Okay, so, what's that to-do test API? Or what's something that just returns JSON? Maybe it says JSON. JSON. People do say JSON. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I wanted to show something here. Okay, so I'm going to use this as an example, and I'm going to come back to this. This is just another concept on the kind of string of concepts we need to know in order to be able to start building the Midway project. So your browser is just doing a fetch. That's all it's doing. It's doing a GET request to this endpoint, and this endpoint represents an API endpoint. That'll make more sense when we kind of look through the weather documentation. But it's an API endpoint that then, per the documentation, I know returns JSON, which is what I wanted, because I want to be able to use this as an example. My browser right now, I use Firefox, so this is kind of prettifying it for me. It's making it look fancy, but really it's just an array of objects. And it's this.
We said JSON. I don't know if I've taught them JSON.
I can explain it real quick. JSON? Yeah, okay, sorry. So the way we write JavaScript, like that syntax, how we create an object with keys and all of that, that way of structuring data is often also used for systems to transmit data back and forth or for files, to create a file. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So in other words, it's very similar to how we would do JavaScript. That's why it looks familiar with the squiggly, right? And then like in this case, it's an array, which is valid JSON. But you can do something called, and I'll show you what this looks like. Oops. So let's say that I have an object like this, okay? And it's A1, B2, C, right? So this is just, I have this object, it has 3 keys like this, okay? Well, whenever we're communicating between systems, we want it to be lightweight, right? Like we want it to be very quick and have high response time back and forth, right? So, but at the same time, we also need it in a way where we can easily manipulate that data with a programming language, whether it's something not JavaScript, PHP, Java, whatever it is, or in this case in JavaScript. And so what happens is when they communicate back and forth, it what we call stringifies this object, and it turns it into JSON. JSON is just a slightly more string-based way of looking at the same data in JavaScript as this object. I'll show you what I mean. So in JavaScript, there's this object that's available to you called JSON. And there's JSON.parse, which turns a JSON object into a JavaScript object in memory for you to work with. And then there's JSON.stringify. And if you do JSON.stringify, what it's going to do is it's going to take your JavaScript object, and if it's valid JSON, it's going to make it into a string with all the spaces and return characters and everything. So like I can do this, and it's going to look like this. So all the keys are now strings. They're explicitly strings. That's why the keys are now in quotations. And because it's a string, we have to escape all the quotation marks so that it's just one string. Okay. And I can actually assign that to, so we'll do it this way. So const object equal we'll just do the same thing, but I'll redefine it. Okay. And then we can say like something like this, okay? So and then do string. So it's the same thing, but this is the stringify version. I can say parse object. I can take the same reference and parse it, and it's just going to give me the same thing. So JSON, like a JSON file can have like the return characters and all that kind of stuff in it. Like that's fine, but it's very, 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 very similar syntax. But there's a few key differences. Like you can't write like JavaScript in a JSON file. All you can have is like this data object here, and then it's gonna make sure you have to make sure that all of the keys are wrapped. So for instance, like if we were to do just a new file here, like I can't say like const whatever, like this is not a JavaScript file. This is a JSON file. It's only for the data itself. So I can either start with open brackets like this or open brackets like this. So either an array or an object. So if I wanted to represent this exact structure right here, so this is a string in JavaScript. But to represent this exact same JSON, I can do like this. Okay. I can do, and notice I can't do B like this, like I could in JavaScript. It has to be a string. Oops. C. So this is valid JSON file. There's actually, if you ever want to test it, you can do like test about JSON. And just like, boom, it's valid JSON. That's very common for us, like if we were to go back to like this, and we were like, you copy and paste it, you don't know if it's valid, you can just take it over here, and it'll validate it for you.
So JSON is just used for like data. It's not like code or like, and I know it's code, but like functions and all that. It's just
Right.
data.
Right, just the data. It's just arrays. So you have essentially the, I don't even know that you can comment in here, but I'll do it just for the sake of this. Like you have the same primitives. So you have string, number, you have Boolean. So I could do the false. I gotta have a comment. You can do objects again, so I can have like a nested object. And then I can have like an array. And then I can, this can be text or false and this number if I wanted to. So I have these same primitives available to me in a JSON format. And often you're not like writing JSON. Like I take that back. That's not true. So for instance, if you remember in the day 3, how we had to install NPM and have this package.json. JSON is one way in which programs they take configuration. So this represents the configuration information for Node and NPM to use and execute the program. It's kind of like a reference thing. So yeah, you're right. It's just data, but we also so happen to transmit that data back and forth between systems, like in an API call, for instance, using JSON. Is this making sense? Good to go? Okay.
So it's how information is sent on the internet. It's with JSON.
This. Okay, so I'm just going to keep that in. Yeah, this is a valid JSON file. If I wanted to read that information, I totally could. So the reason that that's an important concept is because, like Zach was saying, this is how we represent data between systems. It's just like, it's a language, right? In the sense that it's systems that are designed for the internet and know how to read and write JSON so that they can communicate with one another. If they didn't know the same language, they wouldn't be able to communicate with one another. It's just like you and me, right? Presumably, we both know English, so we can communicate with one another. So this is just one way to communicate between systems. So this is a URL. Okay, so what I was saying was just that when I go to a website like google.com, my browser is making a request. That request is going out to the internet. It's finding the right destination using a bunch of magic that we don't have to worry about, but it's very interesting. And then it's returning a response. You can see that if you were to open up your browser, right? So you go to google.com. What it's returning is this HTML. That's what it's returning. And then my browser is interpreting the HTML and rendering to me in the workup. You can request lots of other different types of information. So like in this network request, right? But this is just a get, and it's just going to be interpreted by your browser as, hey, I want to get the contents of this resource. In this case, that resource being a website with content in it, HTML markup. In this case, this endpoint knows that it's only going to return JSON. In fact, most of the time, I'm going to this because I'm a developer and I'm going to be working with this, but most endpoints like this are not designed to be accessed by the browser. They can be because, again, all it's doing is making a GET request. But most of the time, this is going to be accessed using a program of some sort, using a fetch call to this URL up here. So what's happening with browsers and over the internet is that you are using this URL. This is the address telling you where to go. So the first part, the domain, what we call the domain, but then everything after that is going to route it to the right resource. Like in this case, it's post. That's what this concept called REST is. So you look up this idea of REST API or RESTful API. I can include this, and this is probably a good resource for you to go and maybe read and just kind of see how much you understand. But the idea is that all that refers to is the anatomy of your URL. In fact, right here, you see how this says /post/1. Well, what that's saying is I want that particular post, the one with the ID of 1. But if you notice, what I did is I just took the 1 off and said, I don't want just that one post. I want all the posts, which is why it's returning to me all of those. And that's just convention. I just knew that as an experienced developer that I can probably do that. They don't have to implement it that way, but I just assume, hey, maybe they might do that because I want to get a list of information back instead of just one. So this idea is that the address or the resource that you want, in this case, posts, or it could be like in the case of like your shopping cart, there's like a product or product ID. That's what we mean by resources, is these things on the internet that represent real things in real life, right? Whether it's a user or whether it's like I said, a product, in this case, a blog post, a comment on a forum, whatever it is, that's what that refers to. Okay, so let's rewind real quick and go back over. So in order to be able to build our midway project, we need to know a couple of really, really important concepts. We need to be able to understand how to make a request. Using the fetch, in order to do that, we know that we need to know a little bit about this thing called the promise object and how to work with it. So you have .then syntax and you have async await syntax. We are going to use the .then syntax. We'll introduce you to the async await syntax, but the idea is there's just two different ways to write essentially the same thing. JavaScript gives you the freedom to kind of go by your own convention in that sense. And then what the fetch API is doing is it is going to a URL. That URL represents like an address, a destination. And then like in this case, this is movies.json. You'll see that sometimes where it'll specify, hey, this is a JSON endpoint. And then we went over the fact that the reason we use JSON is because it's easily interpreted by our JavaScript or by other languages. And there's also, by the way, there's other ways of representing and structuring data, whether in a file or whether over like API calls. But overwhelmingly, JSON is used and you have to know it. So that's why we're teaching it, obviously. And because it's so tightly coupled or tightly buddy-buddy with JavaScript, since the notation is so similar, we can just use that and be okay. We can get like 80% and you'll be off like doing some cool project with your cool new job before we really have to worry about a bunch of other stuff, right? So, cool. Again, we have to get exposed to these concepts in order to work with them. Any questions? Because I know that was a lot. Actually, what questions do you have? What's confusing? What's like, what piece is not clicking?
We don't promise again, what it promises.
Yeah, and we're about to work with one, so I can kind of show you how that looks practically. That's often the best way to kind of like go about it. So yeah, but I want to dive into that, but I just wanted to ask. So promises, we got that. We're coming up. We're gonna cover that more in depth in actual code instead of me just talking.
So our parse and stringify are really the only two methods we're going to be using to kind of like transcribe JSON info for our uses. I don't mean to be that rigid, like
No.
the things we're using, but yeah.
Well, I'll say it this way. Most of the time, the APIs and the libraries you use to actually do this work will do that part for you. You don't often have to stringify or parse. There are times where you will have to, but a lot of times, like node library, like if you're loading a JSON file as like a module, right? I'm pretty sure it'll just load it for you. Let me actually test that. So I have this test JSON. I think I can just require it. I think it'll just let's try. So I don't know if this will work. I come in as JSON string. Oh, so it's already an object whenever it comes in, right? So I can even do type of, and it's an object. So similarly, when you make an API call, if you're sending data, it will often stringify it for you. Will Fetch stringify it for you?
Fetch doesn't move like Axios does.
Axios, yeah. Okay. And then like, for instance, if you notice here, that's what this function is doing for you, actually, is it's doing it's parsing the JSON.
Okay, because I didn't see, yeah, I was looking at the stringify and parse and I was like, that's neither stringify nor parse.
Yeah, so
okay.
So what's happening here, just to explain a little bit, is it's making the fetch call. Then when that resolves, because it's a promise, which we'll get to, the function that, so what happens with the promise and when you do a .then is whatever the result of that thing is what's going to come into the .then function. So in this case, the response object, that could say whatever we wanted it to say. We're just happening to name a response because we know in this case that it's going to be a response object that has these certain properties. In this case, for instance, this JSON function, or JSON method rather. So what we're saying is, go get me that. Okay, when you resolve, I'm going to come back with a response. Now what I want to do is I want to get the JSON. Well, in the case of fetch, and I don't know why it's designed this way, Axios, my favorite API library, is not designed this way, but fetch is designed this way, is you have to call this method in order to get the JSON, but it doesn't respond with just the JSON. It responds with a promise object, the result of which is the JSON. That's kind of confusing, but that's the reason we have to do a .then again, and then this right here is the JSON data. So in this case, it's like, yeah, we don't have to do the stringify. It's doing it for us under the hood, but we just have to know what the return of this is. Because it's a promise, we do another .then. So
In this case, it's parse. Stringify.
parse, yeah. So I'm saying stringify, but it's parsing the stringified incoming from the response. So that's kind of what this is doing. So if I look at like what this is representing to me the like prettified version, but this is just a big JSON string that's coming back in one line, and then Firefox is making it look like this. And then whenever I go to the JSON, it's kind of treating it more like like an object where I can like collapse and just kind of, it's easier to navigate. Okay, yeah, let's just jump into some more practical stuff here. Okay, so this is a really kind of good example. You can use the promise object and create your own promises. Sometimes you need to do that, but most of the time you're working with other code and that code happens to be promise based. So I'm going to put this under promises. So what's happening here is I'm saying this is a promise, okay? So if I do this, I can console.log and see that this is a promise. I'm actually going to.
But can you just, can we just hit the API for this program?
You just want to do the fetch?
I think showing them how to make a promise is gonna be mind.
Okay. To do fetch, I would need.
There's that no fetch.
Okay, that's what I thought. There we go. Okay. All I did here was, which we'll go through this whenever we kind of like make make a new node project, but is I knew that I needed to use this package called node fetch in order to have fetch in node. So I went ahead and made this package.json by doing npm init command, and then that allowed me to install these node modules. So this goes back to this concept that I covered probably that I covered very much in depth in the first class, which is we're switching contexts, right? So we have the browser context and we have the node context. The browser has certain things available to us that the node context does not have available to us, and vice versa. Some of them overlap, like console.log essentially does the same thing in both contexts. So it's kind of a Venn diagram where there's overlap. But like in this case, the fetch API, that is defined here in the browser. Okay. Browsers implement it in different ways, but the way we can kind of test that here is like I can do this. Let's do, yeah. I can try and do this right here. But what it's going to do is it's going to say fetch is not defined. I can also say something like exactly what I did in the browser, which I can say type of fetch here. Oh, it's hitting this error. So let me just comment this out real quick. And the type of fetch is undefined in Node. Okay. The idea here being is that like Node has stuff for us to be able to make, API requests. It's just not available to us like globally all the time, like say the process object or some other things. Like there are some things that are just available to you all the time. There's some things that you have to import. And then if they're not a part of the actual like Node out of the box, then you have to do what I did, which is I installed a version of fetch that can be used in Node. Okay. And you know, I can always just go look up like node fetch. And it's going to tell me exactly what I need to know, which is okay, so npm install node fetch, I do that, and then I just have to this is not the syntax that I've been using. I've been using require, but it's doing the same exact thing. There's a lot of information here about it, but all you really need to know is that now that you've installed it, as I can do. And this is just a variable. It can be named whatever I want, but the convention is whatever you're bringing in and whatever you want to use, then you name that. Okay, so now let's see if that works. Actually, let me see if this works. Zach, what's the easy way of,
What did it say about the require?
it's an ESM module, so it doesn't like require. See.
Are ESM modules?
Well, you have to do certain things. Let's try. What you gonna do?
Um, There's,
So it's available.
there's a V2 version that uses. Okay.
I think it's the newest one.
Wait. There's something called. There's something called crossfetch instead of no fetch.
Crossfetch. So you're getting a little bit of bonus here. I'm going to npm uninstall node fetch. That'll just do some stuff in the package.json and remove it in node module. But then I'm going to npm install. Oops, that's not npm install crossfetch. See if this works. That looks like it's working because it's yellow, so that indicates to me in the way I have mine set up that this is now recognizing it as a function. Oops. Okay, so yeah, so now the type of fetch is function. So we have it defined, now we can use it. And this documentation, it's not a good assumption to make, but in this case, since this is what we call a polyfill, in other words, it's taking something that already exists somewhere else and just making it available in this context. I can assume it's going to work very, 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 very similarly. But I may need to reference this documentation. Yeah. Does everyone understand kind of what was happening just then? So the idea was we were in the node context. We're trying to teach JavaScript and Node, obviously, but like we want to be able to make fetch. Fetch is available to us in the browser, but not in Node. So we just made that happen. Yeah. Is everyone following along with that? Okay. Yep.
So is crossfetch now available in Node, like anywhere you want, or is it local to the file?
That's a really, really great question. So Node and the browser is kind of moving this way too. So this is a good concept. Node works off of modules. So that's why we always have to do this require or input at the top, because that's going to tell us what we want. And a lot of programming languages work this way, like Python, or a lot of files you'll see like have some sort of import or something like that. It's not made global. So in this case, in order to access fetch, we have to do the require to access it in that file, right?
And then are you asking like,
I guess like that, I mean, that kind of answers my question. Like, because crossfetch is on Node, like you've installed crossfetch.
it's, do you want to take the node module, like the node module folder?
It's in this project now.
Okay,
So any JavaScript file that gets run in this project. Now, most of the time, you're not going to have multiple node modules. Like you're just going to have, most of the time, you're only just going to have the one in the project. There's ways where you can set up a whole repository where it's like multiple projects, but overwhelmingly, you're just going to work in a repository. That repository is a Node project, or it's a, say, React project that uses Node for like building and stuff like that. And so you'll just have that one Node modules, that one dependency, which means that all the JavaScript files in that project now can do this. That doesn't mean that they can just run fetch anywhere willy-nilly. It just means that they can import it now.
Okay.
Because what this is doing, all this is doing is referencing another file. It's a way of letting files talk to one another and bringing them into different contexts, right? But in this case, we like, because it's like, for instance, this is referencing the fact that it's in the same directory. It's what's called a relative path. It's saying in the same directory that I'm in, grab this file. This one doesn't have that because it's referencing, what it's going to do is it's going to say, oh, this is probably a node module. So it's going to look like at this and be like, okay, cool. Yeah, this is a dependency. So then it's going to go to node modules and find this folder. But remember, this is all dynamic. I don't care about node modules. I can delete it, I can whatever, and I'll just npm install, and I can always grab it from the internet at any time.
That answers my question. That makes sense.
Yep. Cool. So yeah, so now what we're gonna do, I'm just leaving, I'll make this file look a lot better before I push it later, but now we can just use this example. Now, I'm gonna change it because I think if I were to, remember my browser is just doing a GET request, so if I were to try and go to this, I think this is just like, if you go to anyexample.com/anything, it's gonna look the same, it's gonna look like this. So that's not what we want, because what we want is JSON to be returned. That's what our code is expecting. So I'm gonna go to that JSON placeholder and use this, because I know that's what's going to happen. So I'm gonna just do a couple things here. So let's say that I'm in here, I'm like, oh yeah, I know JavaScript, I can do anything, and then I do this right here. Kind of makes sense in your head, right? So I'm just gonna, for the sake of right here, just for the sake of the vertical space, I'm just gonna do this. And then we can do something like data. Yeah, data. Let's use plus concatenate. You'll see what's going on. Just do this one more time. Okay, so again, we've had a lot of concepts that we need to kind of wrap our heads around in order to make this happen. We have fetch, we have it in our node script because we were able to do an npm install. We now have a endpoint that we know we can get data from, get JSON data from. We're using fetch, and let's step through what's happening as this program is being executed based on the output, okay? And this goes back to the very beginning concept, which was asynchronous JavaScript. So what the first thing that's happening, which for the sake of simplicity, we'll get rid of that. But the first thing that's happening is this is saying, hey, get me cross-fetch. I'm gonna create this variable here, and I want it to be fetch, and I'm gonna use it like fetch as if it were the browser, but it's actually coming from this node module cross-fetch, okay? So then it's logging to the console hello. That's where that's coming from, right? So then what's happening is it's saying, now call this using fetch. But then what's happening is it's continuing to go down the program, and it's executing this next. Okay. Then at some point after this is executed, it doesn't exit, like The program doesn't exit at this point because there's still a pending promise. Remember whenever we saw the result of a promise, it said promise pending? This happens and then this happens. It's returning from JSON placeholder.typeofcode.com. It's parsing the JSON and then it's giving me the result in the document. This is what it's like to work with asynchronous JavaScript, and this is what it's like to work with API calls because our API calls happen in a way that we cannot predict the time and all of that, right?
Yes, he's basically saying that it takes a minute to fetch that data and do all those things, so while it's doing that, it console or logs that goodbye console while it's waiting to process.
So this is what this like being able to do this is what you need to be able to do fetch. Now, if you remember the project that uses, well, both projects will use fetch. The browser project does not need to do anything like import fetch, okay? Because it's global. It's just a global API that is available to us or function that's available to us by the browser. But in the node side, we have to do it this way, right? Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of go through the same kind of process as if I were getting the node side. The browser side is much more simple for the exact same reason that I just said. We don't have to do like import all that, but I'll go and I'll set up like a new project, like a new node project, as if I were setting up the midway challenge on the node side. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to close out of this. I'm just going to notice this. I can do most of what I'm about to do in like Finder. So I can go to documents, or I can go wherever I want, let's say the desktop. I can create a new folder here. And then I can go in here and I can start setting up a project. At some point, I'm going to need to switch the CLI in order to do npm and install node crossfetch. But I'm going to go through it like I would with the CLI, because I think all of you could probably do this. But I'm going to do it how I would with CLI because that's, again, I just want to go through that process again, have some more familiar with the CLI, answer any questions, and just, again, show you how I would do it if I were doing it. And at some point, you do get fast enough with the CLI that this becomes like second nature to you. So open up my terminal. It's at the home. It's at home. Again, I always had a dev folder in home and all the computers that I own. So I go into dev, I go into sit. Okay, coders. I am going to create a new directory. How do I do that? In directory configuration.
In K dirt.
That is exactly and I'm just going to call this name. Okay. I'm going to call, well, it doesn't matter. We can always rename it if we have another node midway check. Good. So I'm going to CD into it. Okay, so for me, I can go ahead and kind of like set it up using a couple of commands. And so I'll probably end up doing that. And then pretty much from there, unless I need a new like package, like in the case of node fetch or something like that, then I don't have to return a CLI. I can get my CLI stuff done now and then just open up VS Code and I'm good to go. Okay. So what I would do is I would just npm init. So what that's going to do is it's going to ask me questions about how to set up the package.json, which has information about like who you are as the author, if there's a license, all that kind of stuff. For our purposes, just hit enter all the way through that, or hit return all the way through that. So then what's going to happen is now I can do npm install. I know that I need, in this particular project, cross fetch, because that's going to allow me to use fetch in this project. I'm pretty sure I need that. Both of them make API calls, right? Both of them make projects too.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I'm going to install cross fetch here. Now what I have is I have node modules, package lock, which you can always ignore that, and package.json. This is like the basic of setting up a node project. Now from here, I can do code current directory and open it up. I don't know why I can't get it to install online, so I'm just gonna open it up manually. Open folder for me. Coders. No big way. And then I can just create a new file called your kind of entry point file, like we would do index.html in the browser, is often like index.js or main.js or server.js, whatever you want it to be. Often it's like index.js. And it's a good convention to follow for reasons that you'll learn about way later. But it's a good convention to follow to keep files that are like the main entry point in that folder as index dot whatever the file name. In our case, is JavaScript. Okay. Okay, so let's say I wanted to recreate calling our to-do list API. Here, what's the first thing I'm going to do? Who can tell me? Actually, let me take that. What's our goal? Let's say that I wanted to recreate that same test.js file, with that had the fetch in it that I'll push that in the curriculum. But what we had going on was just simple. But what were we doing? And if we're recreating it, what is our goal here? Don't overthink it. Just use your words. Yeah, and then what am I going to do with it? Like, what's my end goal? To get the data, right?
Yeah.
To get the data, then I'm going to do, presumably I'm going to do something. Yeah. So that's my goal is to get that data from the URL, right? So then I need some stuff in order to make that happen. What do I need?
Have access to functionality here. That's part of our confusing.
Yeah. I know it's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. The way that you would check that in Node is you would see if I have it here, if I have it installed, and then what I'm going to say is I could go to the Node modules and say like, oh yeah, cross-fetch is there, but I could also, if it's in this dependencies, if it's like, hey, I know I need fetch, I know to make fetch happen in Node, I need to install that package, then I can just do something like this. And anything that's in this dependency is going to make sure it's in that Node modules. I can even just delete this, move it to trash, and then do it again. It's going to reinstall it. It's going to be there. When I do npm install without specifying a specific package to go and grab, it's going to take all the dependencies that are in package.json and make sure to install and make sure to bring those into the Node modules. So to answer your question, yes, now I can be confident that that's the case. And the other thing too is like, just try it. You can just try it, and then if it doesn't work, then like if I forgot to do an npm install, like let's say this is someone else's project, then we can just try and import it. How am I going to do that? Do y'all remember the syntax on how I get the fetch into my program? Someone tell me.
Are you asking right the fetch function?
How do I get fetch into this file right here? It was at the top of my other programs I was showing you.
It's required.
That's right. So, and then to require is going to be assigned to a variable, right? So how do we do variable?
Top of my head. Like, oh, like any variable?
Yeah, const var let, right? So it's just a variable, it's all it does. So yeah, so const fetch, we want it to be called fetch just because it makes it easier for it to line up with our documentation, yeah? And then require cross fetch. So now we can see if this is gonna work. So I wanted to see what it would look like, because this is something that I forget to do and I do all the time. But if I were to try and do this right now, node index.js, it's going to give me this module not found, right? So what did I just say that I can do if I wanted to get all those modules that are in the dependencies? That's right. So now it's going to get that, and I'm going to do node and, oops, I didn't actually. And it's a function, which means it's defined. If it was undefined, that would be a problem, but since it's something other than defined, we're probably good to go, okay? And then I can do something like this, which this will be in the information in the curriculum. So what I can do, fetch to this to string. Fetch returns a promise. So I'm going to dot then. That's going to take a function. And that's going to return a response. So I'm going to return response.json like this. And then the second dot then. So every fetch call is going to have this to.then situation. But this is going to have our data. Sure. Yeah. So this is just an array of objects, and it has our to-do items for our posts. So that process is how I would set up, like begin the process of setting up the Midway project for the node side. The Midway project for the HTML side is obviously slightly different. Y'all can reference a past day, to kind of get started on that. Well, we can obviously help, but maybe just take your stab at, just getting it set up by yourself, and then, come to office hours or something like that if you have any issues. I know that today was a lot, and I know that you all said, like the poll said that everyone's struggling to keep up. We will make sure to keep pace with you all. We're not going to leave you behind or anything like that. So don't be concerned. Rest assured that we're going to try and make sure that you understand that you're working well with the curriculum. But I have to also encourage you in this, okay? You will continue to pick it up the more you try stuff, the more you actually work with it. So if you haven't been doing that necessarily, you're not getting as much out of the curriculum as you could. And that's just the fact. You're not going to just learn it passively. Even watching me code, if we get into the real nitty gritty, you're going to pick it up by building projects, which is why we want to always give you these Midway projects, because these are actual programs. Whether it's the guess the number like I had last week, or whether it's the Midway project or the past Midway project, whatever it is, those are going to help you solidify your learning. So there's you can see kind of the rituals that are kind of being formed, right? You do some warm-ups, you do some of the algorithm challenges just to kind of make sure that you're learning the basics of the JavaScript stuff. But building is where the stuff gets really, 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 really solidified. And that's where you're going to learn. It's also where you're going to start loving it or start hating it. If you're not doing those things, you're going to continue to hate it and you're going to continue to stumble, okay? So that's just advice, encouragement. You all have the capability to do this, to learn this. So keep at it. We're here to help. we're always like, we wish more people would ask us more questions and ask more from us, because like, whenever y'all do that, and for what it's worth, this is like one of the most interactive classes that we've probably ever had. So y'all aren't doing, I'm not saying you're doing like a terrible job or anything, I'm just saying there's always room for more questions, more interaction, more interest in what you're working on, et cetera. So take that for whatever it's worth.
In the parental project, I used in wait fetch and wait response, so is that what the then is? It's taking it's just doing the same thing, saying wait for this and then do the same.
Yep, I promised you that I would show you that, but you're exactly right. It's the same syntax, and I think you can, I'm positive that you could just do it here. So like, let's say we get to our, let me just show. It's a little trickier to do it in a node program because the way the node program ends up executing, but I can show you what that would look like if anyone's interested. But I'll try to do that like right after we wrap up here.
Honestly, it doesn't, I don't want to make one.
Yeah, so it would look something like this, but then you kind of have like this funny syntax that you kind of have to do here, where you wrap an async, you like create an async function here, and then you immediately like call it. Otherwise,
Like, have a name function that you call. Just like,
well, that's true too. It's like, that's a good point. So we'll just say like function main, and it has to be an async function for it to call it. So we'll do, so like this is the first response from that. So we'll await that, and then remember response data, which is the second response that we're getting in here, is await response.json. So the reason I know that is because this is an implicit return, remember, in an arrow function. So it's returning another promise, which is why we can do a second dot then. And then I'd have to call this.
I think you have to do dot catch for a while. All right, go ahead and try it. I think there's like a funky thing where you have to. Okay.
Are you saying because otherwise it would exit out?
Something, I feel like I've seen that, but that's not the
Yeah.
case. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is really common, like where it's just you just call this function and node. So what's happening with node is that if it's not waiting on anything, it's just going to exit out. So that's the reason we have to like wrap this in a function and do it this way. If we just did this, I'm pretty sure it would just exit out without doing anything. Or you wouldn't actually be able to do a wait. And then if you tried this without a wait, it would just. That would make sense because this is still a promise. Response is a promise at this point. So anyways, point is, with an async await, you have to wrap it in a function like this to make it work, and then just call it at the end. So this is two identical ways of doing the same thing. You can see how people would prefer this. It seems a little bit more like line by line. But both syntaxes you will see in documentation. So we need to be able to teach it. We need for you to be able to be exposed to it. And similarly, I think it's easy to get tricked by the simplicity of the syntax. And so I think like learning this kind of first, it kind of helps you understand like, oh, this is what's going on with the asynchronous stuff. And then you can kind of adapt and make cleaner code this way. So yes, that is how you would write this in the exact same functionality in the same way. And in fact, I'm just gonna. So it's still a promise, but it's asynchronous.
I know you guys haven't seen this in like the curriculum yet. It's coming up for the next class. So there's a good article that governs promises in async await.
Yep. So a good thing to do might be to just like make sure that you do the homework and then maybe take a stab at setting up like either the node challenge or the browser challenge or whatever. And like we said, we are going to kind of like cover each concept a little bit, like help you along with the challenges. But again, stumbling is learning. So stumble through it, just be confused, work with it, write your questions down, whatever you need to do to learn, and then it'll continue to sink in as we work our way through the rest, like the last half of this module, where we're at with it. So.
And there, you can choose whichever one. Like you should do both, but you can pick whichever one you want to start with.
Yep.
So if you're like, this node stuff's freaking me out, you can go back to the browser and be cozy.
Cool. Thanks everyone on Zoom. If y'all have any questions or anything, please let us know. We're available, and we will see y'all later.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.